To work on I'm actually going to do the add event listener example here because it's a little different way of handling functions. And you might look at this and I'll say, but wait a minute, this isn't much JavaScript. We're doing a bunch of HTML stuff now, but this is a chance to get practice with the JavaScript and really get it into your hands and understand how it works. So let me show you. We're going to now create a function here, say, and I'll move the alert into it. And now what I'm going to say is images.add pass in the handle click function, and because I want the clicks for all the children, I have to pass a true on the end there. Now, if I wanted, I could have come in here and said function, and done it right in line in the call. It's legal, but it's sort of ugly. So most people in this case will go ahead and just create a named function. Notice this is also something that bends brains of experienced programmers in other environments. I have a function defined inside a function. Totally legal. Because function handle click here is exactly the same as saying this. A function is just another object. You can pass it around just like any other object. In fact, and we'll see an example this afternoon, where you could create a function object and attach a bunch of methods to it. Because it's an object. Bunch of data, bunch of methods, and there's actually there's actually good reasons to do it. So this is one way. So I could say var handle click equals function and use the variable here. Or the fact that every function declaration implicitly defines. I can do this. So that's typically how I would do it. I'm waiting just a minute since some folks are still looking at this, looking a little puzzled. And it's like, OK, give you a second to think about it. Ask your questions. Sorry? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. One too many brackets. That's kind of like autocorrect getting you in trouble. Autocompletion gets you in trouble, too. OK, so let's take this up a level and work with forms in the page. So form inputs. And again, I'm just going to copy this into my workspace. You can also grab this from the samples. So here's a form that says, what is your name? It's a form, has a label on it, what is your name, an input area of type text that says, an input area of type text. And then on load on the window, I go in and I find document has an array of forms connected to it. That's all the forms defined for the page. So I'm going to get the initial form. So document forms sub-0. What's another way of finding that form?
Query selector on the form tag.
Query selector on the form tag. Yep. Anybody else? And there's one more. It's really old school. Get elements by tag name. And I'll get by form and then get back an array of forms. But document form 0 works. It turns out that for every form, there's an array of input elements. So I'm just going to grab the 0th element there. That's the input. And I can then say alert hello and ask for the value of the input. And that's the string the user typed in. So what I just did is I said, when the window loads, wait for the window to load, so the form's there. Find the form, add a submit handler for a submit event on the form. And when the user submits the form, pop up the alert. By the way, any guesses on where alert is defined in the system? Window.alert, exactly. You didn't say where it came from, so the system starts searching and eventually winds up at the global object, which is the window. So if I say that, if I pull up this page and type into it, oh, come on. Oh, okay. Oh, huh. You were working. There's no submit button. Return is supposed to submit, but okay, something happened. Yeah, I could have added a submit button, which also would have worked. But normally just hitting return on the form will submit it. So hang on a second. Let me follow my own advice here. No, you're not reporting any errors. Okay, here. We'll do a little separate lesson here. So load the page up. Oh, well, there's my alert. Okay, who knows why Safari wasn't showing the alert? Now, what could I have done to debug this? What I can do is, sorry, hang on. I did not mean to go opening mail. I'm behind my back there. What I can do is I can go to Sources, open the file, in this case, hello HTML. Drag a bunch of stuff out of the way. I can click over here in the left-hand column. I will actually click at line 13. This blue marker is called a breakpoint. Next time I run the script execution will pause right here so I can look around and see what's going on. So let me reload the page. I don't actually have to in that case. Type in just a letter and hit return. And now you'll see that when I ran it, this line is now highlighted. And so I can now look at things like, here's my local variables. Well, it says input is input with ID of name. And I can even flip that open and see, oh, there's all kinds of interesting stuff on here. But the one I care about is, oh, a list of all, here's all of the handlers, like on blur, on cancel, on can play, on copy, on queue. So there's a bunch of event handlers in here. And what I'm looking for is value. And right there, there's the value of it. So I could see the data was actually there. I actually got to that line. If I had done this in Safari, put the breakpoint there, I would have realized, OK, something's wrong with the alert. To continue from this, I have a bunch of controls up here. This says keep going. Let me put another breakpoint in here and come back and run this again. Now I'm on line 12. I could say keep going, or I can say, let me just disable this breakpoint. Come here. Nuts. Oh, my mouse is not doing what it's supposed to. I can do what's called a step over. Hang on, my machine's wedged. My mouse is wedged at least. What's going on? Okay. Uh-oh, hang on. Something's not right. See, I'm trying to do a program switch, Command Tab, and I'm not seeing the switcher dialog, so hang on just a second. Uh-oh. Something's unresponsive. Yeah, the problem is, let's see if anybody needs to be terminated with prejudice. Well, here's the interesting thing, right? My mouse clicks are not coming through, right? Well, see, nobody's showing up non-responsive. I'm going to kill Safari because well. Any better? No. What's interesting is it's switching without redisplaying. Okay, hang on just a second. I am going to go over to I've got a bad feeling about this. Yeah. Well, see, it's interesting because the Finder is picking up. Okay. I'm going to have to restart this machine. Hang on, folks. I'm really sorry about this. Oh, hang on. Yeah, Safari got itself wedged hard. Oh, come on, don't make me do the big red switch. It's all fun and games till somebody crashes the machine. Then it's hilarious. All right, I guess we're back where we were before. So here's a little bit of a mystery. So let me put in my name again. There we go. So notice I left the alert up. Notice that my name is still in the input box. I dismiss the alert. Oh, what happened to my name? It disappeared. In a lot of applications, you want to get user input using form fields. You don't want their stuff suddenly disappearing on you. So what happened? It's called a default action. So the idea is that the browser has a lot of event handlers built into it. Things like when you hit return on a form, the browser is going to try to submit that form, send it off to another server. If there's no server specified, the browser says, OK, well, I'm done. I'm going to erase all the inputs, reset the form back. Maybe you don't want that form reset. Maybe you want to you don't want the default action to happen. So what happens is that your handler returns, then the browser gets a shot at it. Because the event continues bubbling up the chain. So there's a couple of things. You can keep the event to yourself using a couple of different options. One is this. Let me put this now in. Let's see. Hang on a sec. OK. I can say, first off, every event handler function actually does take a parameter. We haven't shown it to you yet, but it takes the event as a parameter. So I can say event.preventDefault. Prevent default says to the browser, this one's done. Don't do anything more with it. You can also do an event, basically stop propagation, that says, I'm going to intercept it and prevent this from bubbling up any higher so nobody else's event handlers get a shot at it. Because in the worst case here, event prevent default would tell the browser not to do anything with it, but somebody else might have a handler on this submit. So I can prevent the default. You will also see some people on things like form handlers return the value false, which has the effect of preventing the default, except it's a very old way of doing things and it's no longer recommended. You'll get a message in the browser console that says, basically, returning a value there is deprecated. Use prevent default instead. So yeah, so return false is the old deprecated way. So practice. Write yourself a little form handler that takes this page that includes a span for ID name and fill out this function. Get the text from the input, find the span and change the inner HTML. Optionally, input.value is can be read or written. So you can actually change input.value to something else. So a lot of times people will shove an empty string in there when they're done with the form. So go ahead and try it. This code is available if you download it. Otherwise, it's a small change to what you've already been looking at on the screen.
What should this one look like when you...
Yeah, we missed a little of the screen capture there. I'm going to have to restart that screen capture. It's a backup for the recording. And I don't remember what it's called. No, thank you. Let's see if it remembers the settings from before. Looks like it does. Yep. OK. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, I'm going to start doing this slowly on the screen. I'll do little bits of it. So get the text from the input. Right, just ask the input for its value. Find the span. Remember, I can use a query selector. The span has an ID on it. Whoops. Just to be silly. Input. That's fumble fingers. And because I made a change, I better say to the browser, don't do the default thing. And this, because I changed the input value to next, now that's what it says up there. So, if you're implementing forms and you want to drive your user completely crazy, change their inputs behind their backs. Why not? Now we'll set it to blank. And if you notice something different here, I used a placeholder. It's an HTML5 form trick. That's what that light gray text is in the background. So that's what your solution should look like. OK. So we could do the same things in jQuery, just to do a very fast introduction of it here. The idea of jQuery is a library that a lot of developers use because it makes DOM programming a lot simpler. There is also an alternate version, a replacement for jQuery called Zepto, Z-E-P-T-O. jQuery works just like Query Selector and Query Selector All. You give it a CSS selector, it finds elements in the page. But to do that reliably on older browsers, they had to write a big CSS engine. Zepto uses the Query Selector All. It's built into the browser, so it does the same job, but with a much smaller, faster library. So the other thing about jQuery is it normalizes a lot of differences between the browsers because IE is just special. It had some unique ways of doing things that were not standardized like everybody else. So things like the event handling model, there's some minor edge cases that, or drag and drop, for example, that jQuery just straightens out for you. jQuery does some simple animations, simplifies some complex things like AJAX, the ability to go out to a web server from inside of your program, go out, pull some data in. It just takes care of all the details of that for you. So it does some nice things. jQuery publishes a single function called $, and it does a bunch of things. So first thing, it acts like Query Selector All. You give it a CSS selector, and it finds those elements. The elements that it returns, it adds some extra functions to. Or if you take $, and pass in an existing element, it'll wrap it with extra functions. So it's kind of an all-purpose tool. So for jQuery interactivity kinds of stuff, hang on a second. I'm going to open this directly from the repo.
When you get to this document point, lunch is ready?
Ah, lunch is ready? OK. Just do a quick demo here. So I can do something like this, fade out and fade in. And the code for that looks like, let me go grab it. Come on. OK, I just did the fade in on this example because I wanted to show you something else about fade out. You know what? Let's grab lunch. We'll do this afterwards. How long is lunch?
You tell.
Oh, I guess, or they can bring it back?
Yeah, it's upstairs on the second floor. To the,
Okay.
the back lobby there and up there.
What would you prefer doing? Do you want a little bit of separate time for lunch, or do you want to bring it back here? Bring it back? Okay, so Robert, why don't you go ahead and tell them where it is? And little function that says, first off, here's something different with jQuery. So remember on jQuery how we were doing a window.onLoad, waiting for the load event on the window? So it turns out that the load event waits for everything in that document to be loaded, all the images, all the scripts, everything. Maybe you don't need those images. Maybe you don't need everything. So if that's the case, there's events, but they're different in every browser, that are thrown a little bit earlier on what's called DOM content ready, which means the structure of the page is there. Some of the network resources might not be there. But your DOM's ready. The structure's ready. DOM is document object model. So you can pretty much start working now. So jQuery makes that available across all different browsers as document. You take the document object and wrap it in jQuery to add some new functions. One of those functions is called ready. And that gets called when the page is ready to be worked with. And that takes a function callback. So this is the pattern you'll see. Document ready, pass it a function. Now I go get my H1 using the all-purpose $. I just look for it by tag name. Button 1. In this case, I'm actually creating, I decided to have a little fun here. Instead of building the button into the page, I wanted to show you something interesting. So I actually say $, and feed it a chunk of HTML. And what jQuery does is it actually creates that HTML object in memory with some extra functions wrapped around it. And then I can say, in this case, I'll say B1 insert itself after H1. So it'll actually get put into the page after the H1. I could do things like append, append to, insert before, lots of options. Now, the way you write click handlers in jQuery is they attach a function called click, which defines the click handler. So I say B1 click and add the function. In this case, I'll say when they click it, take H1 and call a new jQuery function called fade in that makes it fade in. So I've used a bunch of jQuery tricks here. I've wrapped the document up and defined a ready handler. Ready will fire before window loaded, which can be a significant difference. I mean, on a lot of big production sites with a lot of images, DOM content ready might fire in half a second, whereas the page itself is ready to like 2 or 3 seconds, because the DOM itself is all, the structure's in place well before all the images are loaded. I found the H1 using a standard CSS selector. I generated a new object, called it B1, injected it into the page after the H1, and then added a click handler. And if I open this page up in my browser, living dangerously here. Oops. Well, I guess, where did I go? I missed a opening bracket on the doc type. Wait. Okay, I did something funny here. Hang on a sec. Console says I've got errors. Oh, can't find variable $. Well, yes, because you refer to jQuery, which that's why I was not. Hang on a sec. Sorry. Let me drag a copy of jQuery onto my desktop next to my page. There. That fixes the problem. Now I can do fade. Well, okay, oops, well, I guess a fade in button doesn't really help because H1's visible. Let's go do a fade out. Okay, so you watch me fade things out there. So the thing about jQuery is this. you could do something called method chaining. Anybody who's been writing things like Java for a while knows this trick. When you have an object with a bunch of methods in it, a really common trick is at the end of every method, return the object as the thing you push out of the method. Because then you can say method A dot method B dot method C, and you can just keep going, working on the same object, doing multiple steps. It makes things a lot less verbose. So for example, I could have written B1 button fade in, repeat B1, repeat B1. Or I can add a fade out button by saying, okay, jQuery, create a button object for me. Once you create it, insert it after H1. And by the way, after you've done that insert, go ahead and define a click handler on it. So this style, it's called method chaining. And one of the reasons I'm showing it to you here is not only is it the way a lot of jQuery code's written, but we'll play with some data graphics a little later. We're using D3.js, which is a graphing library, and D3 uses method chaining. But this is a painless way to introduce it, whereas introducing it in D3 can drive you a little mad. It's a little harder to follow. So I have 2 bits of code here. Oops. Let me grab the first one for fade in. So 2 pieces of code to do the same general idea. Create the button, insert it after, add a click handler. But if I really don't want to be verbose, I can just create the button, insert it after, add the click handler all in one. Notice no semicolons at the end of these lines, because that period, this is like I typed it all in one line. If I actually did this, it would work, but it would wrap around in an ugly way. So most people just do a return and an indent before the dot, but realize that is one big long statement. Okay? So let me load this page. Fade out. Fade in. So to do forms in jQuery, remember the form we did earlier? Let's do the equivalent of that hello form now. So in this case, I go ahead and wait for the document to be ready. I can do document form 0 still if I choose to, or I could have done $sign with the form tag. I wrap this in a $sign because I need to take the standard forms object that comes from the browser and add the jQuery secret sauce to it. The jQuery methods. I'll find the input using a jQuery search. And then for submit on the form, takes a function event. I'm just going to be really short here. I'm going to say find the span called name, set the HTML inside of it to, instead of saying input.value, jQuery gets and sets things by giving it a name as a function. Calling the function with no arguments returns a value. Calling the function with an argument sets the value. So I said, give me the value back, set it to empty, prevent default. In this case, not much of a difference in what you're writing. In a lot of cases, the jQuery code for manipulating the DOM and doing things will be much, much simpler than doing the equivalent in straight, what's called DOM API on the browser, because the DOM API is pretty weak. So, use the form example and some jQuery, if you choose, or spend a few more minutes eating your lunch. Hide the paragraph when the page first shows up. When you submit the form, animate it into view using fade out, fade in, or look at jQuery.com and look at the documentation. There's some other animation methods. If the entered text is empty, hide the paragraph. What if somebody doesn't type a name or just hit space, space, return? How many forums have you seen where it says required? It's like phone number, required, space, return. If they weren't clever, you can maybe get away with it. Don't let them get away with it. Okay, go ahead and give this a try. or finish your lunch. I'm going to quickly finish my lunch. And then we will come back to talking a little bit about working with compatibility for older browsers, something we were talking about a little bit at lunch. The example. So I'll take the form example. Oh, wait, close that. OK, I'm going to take this form example. First thing I want to do is hide the entire paragraph. Well, you know, HTML development, you don't have to do it all in JavaScript. So I'm just going to come up here and say style p display none.
Good idea.
Right, start with it hidden. Let me just go and reload the page and make sure that it's properly hidden. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong page. This one. OK, so I hit the paragraph. Now what's the second thing we're supposed to do is on submit animated into view. OK, so let me go hit the code for this. So form submit, I've got the name, I set the HTML. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to say name. I can say, oh, slide in or fade in. I'll just fade it in. And then using method chaining, then set the HTML afterwards. And something's not right. Probably an event prevent. No? Oh, I'm fading in the span. Good catch. Yep, so you're right. I need to do this. I need to fade in the paragraph. So you just need to come and sit and catch my bugs at work. So fade it in, right? Find the paragraph, fade it in. Last thing it says is hide the paragraphs if the entered text is empty. Somebody tries to type a blank. So let's do this. What I can do is first I'm going to say var text equals. I'm going to grab the input value, but then I'm going to trim it. Trim, remember, removes the white space on the front and the back, just so somebody can't fake me out by hitting space, space, return. And then I'll say if there's text, set the input value. And if there's not, I'll just go ahead and hide that paragraph. Try it here. Oops. I've got a typo on 19. What am I missing? Oh, I'm missing an open bracket there. And then auto-completion bit me. So that's how you make it work. So if text means if that string is not empty, the trim makes sure that any extra white space was torn off. So if somebody just types in white space, it's going to come up an empty string. If they type extra white space around their name, that'll be trimmed off. So if text says if it's not empty, go ahead and set the HTML. Otherwise, find the paragraph and hide it. So before we get back into some of the gorier details of JavaScript, I want to talk about making sure that your code's compatible with older browsers and making sure that it runs well, and runs everywhere. So I've mentioned this in passing. There are two flavors of JavaScript. ES3 versus ES5. ES stands for ECMAScript. It's actually the formal name of JavaScript. And so ECMAScript version 3 is what was current when IE6 came out. IE6, 7, and 8 all implemented, in fact, actually largely even IE9, implemented mostly ES3. And they implemented a special flavor of it called JScript, which means you could have this beautiful, wonderful script that runs everywhere, and then it goes on IE and it fails. It's not to knock on IE, even though it's, even though it's kind of a popular pastime among web developers. It's to say, okay, look, I'm going to be shipping a commercial script. I need to make sure this works across all my browsers. How am I going to do that? And there are some tools and techniques for making sure it's going to work. Also, not all browsers have the same APIs. So your modern browsers have something called DOM, Document Object Model Level 3. That's where query selector all is defined. There's some other page manipulation options. There's some cool stuff. And the event models can be different from IE to what everybody else does. So one way is to use jQuery to iron out the differences between the event models, the ability to find, the differences between DOM manipulation. That works. It's a little expensive in terms of size. Another one, if you know you're on a more modern browser, is called Zepto. Let me pull that up. So Zepto.js is a very small, very lightweight equivalent to jQuery. It does like 95% of what jQuery does, but in much less size. It's like a sixth of the size. It requires a fairly modern browser because it uses query selector and query selector all. But iOS 3 plus Safari, Chrome versions, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, iOS, Android, and IE 10 plus. So it's a nice library to think about if you're on a newer browser. Another thing you can load is called the ES5 shim. And the ES5 shim, kind of what it says on the tin there, ECMAScript 5 compatibility shims for legacy JavaScript. So a lot of the features that were added to ES5 that don't require language keyword changes like getters and setters are available here. So like a lot of the array stuff and those techniques, you can actually load some of these scripts up as you need and back patch your older browsers to act like the new stuff. There's also, as long as I'm here, there's a compatibility table, which I should just add to the talk on. I should just add to the repo on GitHub. If you look up Kangax, K-A-N-G-A-X ES5, you'll get his ECMAScript 5 compatibility table, and you'll actually see for all of these things like date.now, array.isArray, string prototype trim. So string trim, for example, we've been using, is actually not available in IE7 and IE8. That's one you'd have to shim back in. So this tells you what features are on which browsers. Now, that's a lot of stuff to remember. So one of the things you wind up to, oh, one more tool. Sorry. Having a Columbo moment there. Oh, God, I dated myself. So Modernizer is a feature detection library, M-O-D-E-R-N-I-Z-R. The old way of knowing what to do for a given browser was on the server side, when somebody went to get your page, look at what's called the user agent string and say, okay, what does this browser claim to be? And return a page that works with that. That is not a particularly reliable way to know what browsers are up to. And besides, browsers lie. They pretend to be other browsers with more market share, for example. So there's a library called Modernizer that you run early in your page, and what it does is it goes through and detects for all the new HTML5 features which ones your browsers have and which ones they don't. And then you can say, in your code, you can say modernizer.load, give it the name of a test, and say, if this test passed, load that library, otherwise load this one. So you can have a fallback for browsers that don't do the most modern thing, and then whatever you need to load for the browser that does support that modern feature. It's also got some tricks in it for CSS, like if you can test and see, does the browser know these new CSS tricks? And if so, you can use those tricks, which are much smaller, and otherwise fall back to longer, more detailed things. I'm not really going to spend time in Modernizer, but it should be part of your toolkit. You should know about it. So that answers the question where you were asking, should I have a piece of code somewhere that says if this is IE, load jQuery, and if it's not, load Zepto? You could actually use Modernizer to say, do you have query selector all? And if you do, load Zepto. If not, load jQuery, kind of thing. Now, testing tools. We'll talk about this a little bit. Wait a second. Oh, there we go. OK. So testing tools. The best answer to making sure your code's compatible across all your browsers is to test it across all the browsers. So have automated testing. There's a bunch of automated test tools for JavaScript. I'm going to talk about one of them called QUnit. It's used to write unit tests. But what you can do, actually I'll mention one other thing called JS Test Driver. Once you've written your QUnit tests, you can set up a special server. Doesn't require any fancy hardware. It just runs as part of your browser in JavaScript that a bunch of your browsers all point to. And basically, every time you make a change to your code, you tell this server, OK, ask all of those browsers to rerun the test suite. And all of the browsers that are looking at that server will get handed a page that says, OK, run this code now. They'll all run the test suite and report back. And so you can find out maybe this script works on everything but Firefox at a certain level, or it works on everything but IE over here, or it breaks on Safari. But it's nice to have a fleet of browsers that you can automatically control, kind of run the puppet strings on to figure out, run your tests and basically figure out when things are broken. So QUnit is really quite simple. Let's look at a standard QUnit test. So in QUnit, and actually I'm loading this straight from the QUnit CDN, so I should be able to run it directly. I go ahead and I declare my page, character set, title, load a style sheet for CSS. I have a div here with ID of QUnit, and that's where QUnit's going to give me a report that says, did my test pass or not? I load the QUnit script itself, and then I declare two things. I declare the code that I'm testing. Normally I'd use script src equals to load a file from somewhere else. For this example, I'm doing it all in one file. So I declared a function for average, just like we did this morning, x plus y divided by 2. And then I declare, now here's my tests. I give them a name. So I say module, I'll call this set of tests averages. I use the QUnit keyword test. I give it a name for the test. And then I pass in a function. And the function does some work and then calls QUnit and says, OK, if you call average of 2 and 4, calculate that number, that should be equal to the number 3. So equal says compare these two values and basically flag the test as passed if they match, flag it as a fail if they don't. So test that even numbers work, test that adjacent numbers work. So I could write a bunch of clauses in here that say equal these two values. And QUnit lets you do some different things in the clauses, like say if something is true, you just say OK. Or if they're not equal, or if there's no exception. So there's a bunch of options. But this is the basic idea of QUnit and unit testing, is you write a bunch of instructions out that say, OK, if you run this code, here's the result I expect. See if it passes. And then if I load this in my browser, QUnit runs, and it comes up and says, here's my test. It passed. It's green. It actually says passed here. And if I click it, it says, OK, so even numbers worked and adjacent numbers worked. Let's say I made a mistake in my code. Let's say that I forgot the parentheses. Rerun the test. Now it says, oops, that failed. And it reports to me exactly what the error was. A lot of developers use this technique called unit testing and test-driven development to incrementally write a set of tests and then write the code that matches it and work in parallel. So they're writing tests and code at the same time. And even though you're writing twice as much stuff typically, the advantage here is the minute you make a mistake, since you're doing all these small incremental things, it points you right where the bug is. You actually tend to write code a lot faster because it homes in on exactly where the problem is. Let me go back and fix that, because having passing or failing tests just bugs me. OK, now it works. Let's see. I've talked through it and give you the reference elsewhere. So one of the clever hacks you can do in here too. What? Oh, I see. One of the clever hacks you can do. Oh dear, my page got all banged up. Hang on a second. That's not right. Okay, there's the first fence. There's this. Oh, okay. Some leading spaces snuck into my markup. There we go. That looks better. So one of the interesting things. Ooh, ow. Back is not supposed to do that. One of the very interesting things you can do in here is, let's say we set this page up. Not there. I've added a new div called QUnit fixture, and I've put some HTML inside of it. One of the ideas of unit testing is that every time you run your tests, the system is reset to a known condition before the tests get run. So QUnit actually records what's inside that fixture. It makes a separate copy in memory. And before every test is run, it actually puts that HTML back into the page, which means I can write code that modifies that HTML and then run a test to make sure that it was modified the way I expected, and then reset it and test it under another condition and reset it and do it again. So it's really nice if you're writing code that builds pages programmatically, you can actually verify in code that all of this stuff is working correctly just by putting your setup in the QUnit fixture. And then let's do some code here. So I'm going to write a function to add a row to the table, and I'm going to use using jQuery just because it's much simpler to read and write. I have to close that. So I'm going to write a function called add rows that says find the table, and for var equals 1 to the number of rows, table append. Append is another jQuery function. It means add a child. Add a table row with the table data. So just add that. And then my test is, I give the module a name. First test I write is usually just, is everything set up correctly at the beginning? So I say OK, meaning this is true. I have a test table. OK passes the test if the first value is truthy and fails if it's falsy. So if I say look for the test table, I'm either going to get back the test table or I'm going to get back null, which null would be falsy. So I just make sure I've got the table. Equals test table tr length. Test table tr says find all the rows. That gives me back a jQuery array. jQuery arrays are not real arrays, but you can pretend they are as long as you're writing all jQuery code. So what's the length of that? Well, OK, that's make sure that it's 0, that there's no rows defined initially. And now my next test, I call add row once, and then I ask, OK, test table tr, now there should be a single row in the test table. So I've just tested that DOM modification code. Now, there's another nice thing then. Once you've got automated tests written, called JS Test Runner. And there's more than one of these, but this is kind of the oldest and the most reliable. And it works with jQuery. This is the thing I was talking about where it sets up a little micro web server on your machine and has a bunch of browsers all listening to that micro web server at the same time. And when you basically say go, it says to all those browsers, here's a fleet of unit tests. Run them, please. And so maybe you've got IE and Firefox and Chrome and a couple other browsers sitting on your machine, or a couple of a couple machines sitting on the network. And they all run the tests, and then they all report back to that central server. And that central server comes up and says, OK, these either all passed or some of these failed. And if some of these failed, it'll tell you what browser failed and where. What was the error message? So it's a way of making sure that all of your browsers will run your code. There's another one called Test Swarm, SWARM. Takes a little more setup, but it's really nice. So, and these are all free and open source. These are things you should know about. So, OK, I'm going to, let's see, looking at time, I don't think I'm going to do a test-driven development lab. This note is here, so if you're curious about using QUnit, give this a try. Maybe you try it separately or on a break. And my contact information is also in here. So if you try anything in here and are not sure, you can always email me. Perfectly happy to help out, send you examples. So here, this is the this is probably the most complicated part of the class, this next bit. But it's also, I think, probably the most important. So we went through the basics of JavaScript this morning. Functions, variables, data types, coercion, comparison, control structures, data structures. All that kind of basic computer science, basic stuff you need to know about a language. A lot of you have not done any programming, which is fine. You're just picking it up here. Some of you, though, if you're coming from other languages, you have certain assumptions and beliefs about how computer languages operate. JavaScript breaks a lot of those rules. It looks a lot like the languages you know, but it acts very differently internally. So this is the part where you learn to speak JavaScript like a native. So as opposed to, say, speaking it with like a Python accent or a Java accent. So 3 rules. Everything, and I do mean everything, is an object. So that var x equals 4, that 4 is an object. It's a type number. That function that you just declared is an object. In other languages, it's not necessarily an object. It's just a piece of code living kind of in its own separate world. But in here, it's actually an object. Second thing is, and this will be new to some of you and not new to the programmers in the room. Objects are connected using something called a reference. So I'm going to say var x equals 4. The variable x is a little piece of memory that's reserved. It's almost like a little box somewhere in memory. It's like a little P.O. box. This actually has what's called a reference to an object out here that contains the number 4. And so I can say like y has a reference to maybe the object hello. So let's say that you're in a function and you declared var x and var y, and now you're done with the function. So the function goes through, actually, so let's say I'm in function test. So test itself is an object in memory. Remember, everything is an object. And this object actually has references to its own variables. So now we're done with the test. The function goes to clean up. It says, OK, system, I'm done with the references. I'm done with these variables, so I'm going to let go of the reference to them. What JavaScript does is when a variable has when an object has no more references to it, it's garbage collected. Garbage collected means it's basically swept up and removed. It's cleaned up for you. In a lot of other programming languages, if you ask the system for a little bit of memory, you are responsible when that memory is done for saying to the system, it's time for you to let go of that. JavaScript does that management for you automatically. So in this case, the reference to this x gets cleaned up. This separate 4 object gets cleaned up. This y gets cleaned up. This hello gets cleaned up. It's all reclaimed. It may not disappear the very instant the function ends. Usually the way JavaScript works is it goes through and sweeps periodically. But it will get recycled. It will get picked up. With a couple of things we're going to do in here, you might go, wait a minute, that can't be true. When in doubt, draw a picture of the actual objects and the connections between them. Because that's, especially for the Java programmers in the room, or especially for the C programmers in the room, there's something in here that's going to probably give you a bit of a headache. But if you remember these rules, it'll help. OK. No, not there. So, things that make JavaScript different from your other languages. A scary term called functional programming, which you hear passed around and usually followed by a bunch of really weird stuff. Functional programming just means this, that a function is an object and you can pass it around like a variable and you can pass it in other functions. That's it. There's a bunch of other stuff in functional programming, that, if you look at like the Haskell language and stuff. But in reality, functional programming just means that functions are objects and you can do things to them. And that lets us do some interesting tricks called like closures. There was a question about figuring out the value of this. So far, I've given you very simple examples. I'll actually tell you how this behaves and how to work with it, where the gotchas are. And there's more than one way to create classes. I showed you the whole thing with a constructor function and prototype. There's more than one way to do classes. So functions. A first class function means that you can store it in a variable, you can pass it as a function argument, you can return it as a value from other functions. It's just another value. So I might say, well, like if I say function foo, that's the same as saying var foo equals function. You're just creating a variable with a reference to that function object. I can even say, as it shows here in the bottom, and I'll put that in a bigger type, I can create an object with a field of foo equals some function. You've actually seen this. You've done this. So here's an interesting one. Let's say I want to find all the odd numbers in a list, in an array. So I can say odd values is an empty array. Do a for loop that goes through the whole odd values. Oh, hang on. I called it A there. Let me just call it A, make my life simpler. So for every element in A, test and see if it's odd. Let me just do this, because you guys know this version better, the mod 2 version. Oh, hang on. I know what my problem is. So I could say, look at everything in A. That's what that for loop is doing. If this element in AI mod 2 means divide it by 2 and look at the remainder. If the remainder is 0, it's even, and we don't want it. If the remainder is 1, that'll be truthy. And it says B, push, meaning add to the end of B, the value that we just got. So that'll pull all the odd values out of the array. Most people are saying, OK, yeah, I agree with this. A couple of folks need extra caffeine. It's OK.
I have a question.
Yes?
In your for loop there, should that be I++ at the end?
Yes.
And what exactly would A++?
It would probably be disaster. The skies would fall. So that was just a typo. That was called working too fast and not checking that code. But here's a really interesting way to do it. It turns out that array declares a bunch of methods on itself, and one of those methods is called filter. Filter looks at every object in the array and calls a function. And the function that it calls is one that you supply, and it passes in that element to the array. And if that function returns true, then filter includes that value in its output. And if that function returns false, it's ignored. So I'll declare a function is odd. X mod 2 or x and 1 will either work. I should have used this version because this one's easier to explain. So is odd returns true if it's an odd number and false if it's not. So odd values I call a.filter. So I say look at every element in the array, call is odd for every element in the array with the value of that element, and if it returns true, include the number in the output. That will give me back only the odd values.
Is this faster than reading the loop in terms of execution?
Is this faster than actually writing the for loop? Oh, yes. Much faster. Not only is it faster, it's shorter. Just easier to write and easier to read. So does this make sense? We're passing the function in and doing stuff with it. And if you go through and look at MDN at the array definition, you'll actually see there's a bunch of nifty things to find on array. So that filter could be an anonymous function. You don't have to give it a name. Right? I can just declare a function with no name. By the way, side note here. Since you saw me using the debugger and setting a breakpoint before, the breakpoint will tell me what things have been called to get me to this place. Anonymous functions, though, don't show up with any name in that list. Kind of a pain if you're debugging. You can actually give that function, that inner function, a name just for the purposes of it'll show up in the debugger. So function, whatever name you want, parenthesis. Yeah, it's perfectly legal. Old versions of IE choke on it, but if you're testing on like IE7, what's the point? Most people are on IE8. But yeah, if you're doing it on like 8 or later, or any other browser, you can name that anonymous function. Now there's an oxymoron. Nope, in fact, there it is. Okay. So just for fun, I showed you array.filter where it takes a function and picks out everything where that function returns true. There's array.map that takes a function, that function gets the value from one element in the array, and whatever value you return from that function, it puts in the output array. So if I wanted to double the numbers in an array, what could I do? I could write a function that does what? Takes whatever x is passed in, returns x times 2. Give it a try.
Would you really need to write a function, or could you just kind of put that code there without sort of writing it with a function?
So
Said map parentheses 2 times x, it would just something like that.
if I said map 2 times x, yeah, it would fail because it's expecting a function. So I would have to wrap it. So I just did it here in the console. Let me fix this here. So var a equals, given an array, define function double x, and then just call a.map, pass it the function. Like I said, JavaScript itself is actually a pretty small, pretty compact language. It's just learning to take these handful of things that it does and really work with the implications of them is where the interesting bits are. You could have also said var right, I could have declared it as a variable. Same thing. The other interesting thing to know about the function iterators, as long as I'm mentioning them, is they actually take the value and the index. So whatever the count number is inside the array. Actually, the third thing that they take is the array itself. But I'm not bothering to name those. So I could actually have said, let me do another function here. And then I could have said a.map indexed. And I actually would have gotten back the index numbers. Because this function gets called not just with the value at that point in the array, but what's the index number in the array. Sometimes you care about those things. Okay so far? I know this is the part where it gets to be a little more difficult. So,
Could you just flip the angle up a little bit?
Up there?
Okay, thanks.
And there's some other really clever tricks, like there's map, which is this thing that applies the function. There's filter. There's a thing called reduce, which goes over all the elements of the array and collects the result in one number, which is pretty cool and really nice to write with. So they're worth playing with. Okay, here's where I hope you had a good lunch, because this is where you're going to need a little brain fortification. A thing called a function closure. So if you take the example of the buttons, and this is slightly contrived, but I've tried not to make it too wacky. Let's say that I've got 4 buttons on the screen, and I want to count the number of clicks in each one. Click on A, click on B, click on C, click on D. This is actually a really common pattern, by the way. So one way to solve that here's one solution. Oops, sorry, hang on, I can't do that. I can do that. So one solution is declare a variable object called, or a global object called counters, A, B, C, D fields. The IDs of the buttons are A, B, C, and D. Write a click handler that says, okay, you haven't seen this yet. So when the event comes into me, there is a field on the event called event.target, which is where the event was originally dispatched. So that'll tell me what button was clicked. Since the buttons have an ID on them, there'll be an ID field on the button. So I'll get event.target.id. That'll be the string, either A, B, C, or D. I'll find counters with that key on it, so A, B, C, or D. I'll add 1 to it. I could have used count++, but I was really trying to be kind. And then push that value back onto the object. So counters A, B, C, or D equals the new count. And then just for fun, event target inner HTML equals the ID plus, and put the count in parentheses. Give that a moment to sink in. This is nothing fancy yet. This is pretty straightforward. We'll get fancy in a minute. Okay, where's my window? A, B, C, and D. So as I click, I count them up. Okay, so far, nothing that you couldn't do with what you already knew. Can you do it without the global? And again, this is slightly contrived, but this is one example of a very, very common use case. So what I could do is I could actually make an event handler for each. Let me update my code. So I'm going to create a function called attachClickHandler that takes a button. So I'm going to go over all the buttons in the object and call attachClickHandler. AttachClickHandler gets the button's ID, sets the count to 0 in a variable, and then calls button.onClick, gets a function that increments the count and bumps up the inner HTML. Now some of you are going, okay, so what's so weird about that? Which I envy you, because great. I'll explain why it's not so weird. The C programmer in the back of the room is going, oh? Because here's the thing. You look at these variables are declared at the start of the function. And what did I say earlier? When the function is done, all of its variables get cleaned up. What happens is this. Inside of this is a brand new function object that's created for each button. That button's click handler has a reference to the function. So as long as that button's on the screen, that function still exists in memory somewhere. It still has a reference keeping it alive. This function is referring to a variable that was in existence at the time it was created. In this case, the variable is not a global. The variable is in the outermost function. Because this has a reference to that count object will actually be kept alive in memory and linked to that inner click handler. Same thing for the button ID. So I've created a new function using some variables from its parent function. And because as long as that inside function stays alive, the things that it points to will also stay alive. What you'll see this is called closing around. The inner thing's called a function closure. And the process is called, it's closing around ID and count. It kind of wraps itself around them and says, okay, I'm going to take you with me now. Nobody else will actually have access to ID and count once that attached click handler goes away. They're just objects sitting out in memory somewhere, but this click handler will have a reference to them. And so it carries those around with it. Mostly nods from the room.
So if you declare
How's my group of designers doing? You okay? Mostly. I'm just checking because this is kind of a tricky part, and I just want to make sure people have got time to kind of sort it. Sorry? Great question. So is that function handler created before or after the click? It's created before. It's created as soon as I call attach click handler.
What would happen if you define that function inside attach click handler, but not on the left of the
So if I had defined function, good question. If I had defined a function inside of attach click handler, if I had done this, If I had done that, same thing as before. Perfectly legal. Basically what happens is this is the same as declaring var count the clicks equals function whatever, which means a new copy of that function is allocated, is constructed every time you come through attach click handler. So it's the same idea. And the reason why you do this is there are a lot of cases where you need to attach some kind of event handler to an object on the page, and that event handler needs to have some knowledge of something else that was going on in the system, say it was going on at the time. So you will see a lot of programming where people have functions like make click handler, where the only job of make click handler is to give you back a new handler function that wraps up a bunch of data that was alive at that moment. So that's essentially what we're doing here. It was just easier to wrap it up in an attach to demonstrate it. Another way to do it, so here's another example of closures. This is not inside of a page. So create a function called make counter. Give it a number. Have it return a function that does something like add a number to x and return the new value. So I can call var count equals make counter and then call count the first time, and it gives me back a 1. Count the count function a second time and it returns back a 2. Okay, this example is again pretty contrived. It's very basic, but it's a setup for where we're going. So in fact, take this make counter example and pass in an initial value. How do you give it something that makes it not 0 at the beginning? So give that a try. And then if you're feeling bold, do the counting buttons. Can you show the count somewhere else in the page, like in a span instead of inside the button? So we'll take about 5 minutes for you to do this. So let's start with the first question. For function make counter, if I wanted to set an initial value, I could just pass it in as a variable. Right, pass it in, x gets start that initial value, I return a function that now closes around this this copy of x that's in memory. If I called make counter a second time with a second value, it would actually have its own private copy of x as well. Now, doing the counting buttons, I won't spend time on it, but if you're curious, we can sit down and do it later. It's actually not a big deal to do. Okay, so now we can talk about this. I have been very careful in setting up the examples so far that the value of this is always something sensible. It's almost never something sensible. So let me show you actually what's going on with that. So here's another counter. I'm going to declare, in this case, a counter object that contains a count and a handle click function. This is, again, a really common pattern. So far, we've been keeping the count in a variable and keeping the function separate. Most people are going to wrap them up together in an object. So this handle click takes an event, bumps the count up by 1. OK, sensible. Sets event target inner HTML. OK, sensible. Button.onClick equals counter.handleClick. Doesn't look too bad, although I'm kind of leading you down the garden path, and I'll show you why. So this is not the object you are looking for. Move along. The problem is this, that in the event handler, this is actually changed by JavaScript to not be the parent object, which is normally what this is. It's changed to be the object that got the event, in this case, the button, which was meant to be very helpful, and it does make some code shorter, but it creates a gigantic headache when you're trying to get to this dot count inside of your object, and this pointer is somewhere else. So what happens if you try to run this? You ask, let's say you added a console.log at the first line. Console, this would say object HTML button element. This dot count would be undefined because we're not pointing at the correct object right now. So what I would do is I would actually call this dot count, add 1 to it, and then set the inner HTML. And the button would come up with its name plus NAN, not a number. It's one of those really wacky little debugging things you hit. So, I mean, it can be nice that this reduction basically makes it possible to write really tight little click handlers that look like this. You know, count plus plus, use a variable, count plus plus, this inner HTML equals this ID. Right, nice and tight. But it was really written for an era where this was procedural programming, not like object-oriented or functional, where everything was in a variable. It was all in the global scope, and that is so 1990s. So we have to do something special to keep this from drifting around on us. And it's very simple. What you do, let me grab the example again. So created the object at the top, created handle click. When I say button.onClick, there's 2 ways I can do it. One is I can write a new function that says, OK, relay to counter.handleClick and pass the event. It's called trampolining. I've built myself a little trampoline function that may basically bounce the request off of. That's one way to do it. That will work on every browser. If you are on a newer browser that does ES5, you can do something even simpler. You can say counter.handleclick.bind to counter. So bind takes a function, because remember, a function is actually an object. So every function has a method available on it. I know, that's a brain twister right there, called bind. You can call bind on any function and say, whenever you call this function, set this to counter before you actually call the function. And what it does behind the scenes is it actually creates a new function that sets that basically does a call through. But this trick right here keeps this from drifting around. It locks this to be counter whenever you're inside that object, inside that method, I should say.
I've heard of people putting a new variable and assigning it at the very top of the counter function with a new name, something like var that was this, and then use the that inside. Does that generally work?
Yeah, okay. I was actually going to not go down that particular rat hole, but okay, what the heck, I'll show you. So what some people will do is write a piece of code that looks like this. And by the way, we've just been offered an afternoon sugar break. You may want it after this. Turn this into an IIFE. There we go. So this little brain teaser is what you were asking about. So one way of doing handle click is to write an outside wrapper function. Notice, this function, no, wait. Sorry, hang on, I put this in the wrong spot. There. Yes, that's what we're supposed to do. And then this inner parent comes off. So one of the dirty tricks you can do, and this is actually what bind is kind of doing behind your back, is for handle click, instead of defining the function, you have parenthesis, you have a function, and at the end you actually call that function. What that outer function does is it records the value of this at this moment, not inside of a click event, sticks it in something called that, and then builds a new function closure that uses that to get access to its parent. Yeah, which then lets you do wacky things like because this, in this case, inside the handler is going to be the button. Yeah, it's just a little bent. There are some frameworks like Backbone.js where this trick is pretty much mandatory, because it will call you back in a context where that or where this is not what you expect, and so you've got to do that little wrapper dance. But honestly, function bind, if you have it, meaning if you have an ES5 compatible browser, is just, it makes so much more sense. This business is just, lunatic. But sometimes you got to go this far. On the other hand, think about it. You can look at this and kind of understand what's going on. Guarantee you couldn't do that when you walked in the door this morning. So you are making progress.
That's true.
It helps to remind you all when you're, in the midst of great deep confusion that really it's not as bad as it feels. So I've already shown you the bind example, actually. So to wrap this all up, here's my new version of attach click handler. Attach click handler button, standard object, nothing fancy. But now I say button.onClick, and I go ahead and just do the bind. The bind returns a new function where this is properly pinned. And then I do a query selector all. Now, I would say query selector all for each and use the for each iterator, except that query selector all doesn't return an actual array. It returns a thing that has a length and lets you access individual, but it's not an actual array. So you have to fall back on the for loop. Okay, there's a sugar break upstairs. Same place you grabbed lunch. I'm gonna hang out here. Actually, I may come up and get a little caffeine. So cakes, Pellegrino, coffees, cookies, brownies, etc., and leftover sandwiches. Let's take a quick break, run upstairs, grab that, come on back. We're actually doing really well. So of this entire class session, this is how much is left. So we're actually right on time.